Hello and welcome. I'm Catherine from Crystal Pegasus Costumes, and this video is all about the process of being a pattern tester. I was very fortunate to be a pattern tester for Lina Piprek's new book, Time Capsule Wardrobe, which contains sewing patterns inspired from 3 historical eras. In particular, I was a pattern tester for 2 of the Georgian era inspired projects, the Georgian Petticoat Skirt and the Georgian Polonaise Dress. And now that the book is out, I'm very pleased to show you how that process went. This video will be mainly looking at the Georgian Polonaise Dress. Being a pattern with a close-fitting bodice, it was a bit of a journey and very interesting to see behind the scenes of the process. I'll also include a few snippets of the Georgian petticoat skirt as well. So for now, I think we just need to head back in time to the start of the process. So it is now all systems go here over the next 2 weeks of the pattern test. Yesterday I got my fabric washed and dried. I've got a really fun print as my main fabric, and then a coordinating solid for use of the bias binding and the hem facing. There's a number of things that this pattern test is testing, and a key one of that is bodice fit. So from my measurements, bust, waist and high hip, I'm a straight size I. So what I wanted to do was start just with a straight size I, and we can take it from there. I do anticipate that I'll probably need a slightly smaller back and a slightly larger front, as that is what is normally the case for me. I started my first toile by roughly cutting out the bodice pattern pieces. I marked my size with a highlighter and then cut them out. I pinned the pattern pieces along the grain indication, weighed them down and cut out my toile fabric with a rotary cutter. So I have my front, side back and back all ready to go. Starting with the back pieces, I added the stay stitching, then stitched the curved seams, then the centre back. I snipped and folded down the seam allowance so that I had the final dimensions of the back bodice. Similarly, I added the stay stitching to the front pieces, then folded and stitched down in the seam allowance along the edges. I joined the front pieces to the back and taped in some temporary bones at the directed locations. I pinned on a temporary lacing panel to the centre front and stitched in place on both sides. I pinned on the straps, ready for a quick and easy adjustment if needed. So the bodice sewed together beautifully. It all lined up, it came together, it was very clear. So that side of thing is like tick on the pattern testing side. But now let's look at me, because everybody is different and my body is not the same as the standard dress form shapes. So let's look at how this pattern fits on me. So currently I'm wearing a chemise and I am wearing a bra underneath, and basically while this bodice, which is a bodice with no negative ease, it does fit at the bust and the waist. Yeah. It fits there, but it doesn't fit my shape, and I guess quite frankly, it doesn't make me feel good. So we don't want that. Let's look at what we do know. Essentially, a big flat panel like this is not going to fit over my curves and come in under the bust. It can't do that. So we need to look at alternatives. So I'm now going to try it on without the bra, though given that there's no negative ease at all, I'm a bit dubious about what that will look like. And without a bra, this garment just doesn't provide me any support at all. None. So my next step is going to what I had anticipated would be what I did, and that's I'll put my stays on and fit this over that. Okay, this is much more like it. You can see that the front of the bodice is sitting smoothly over the front of the stays. The back is sitting smoothly over the back. Well, pretty well. And the straps are covering my stay straps. But what you might have noticed is that in order to show you how smoothly they're sitting, I had to be pulling it around. And overall, I think this bodice is just too big for me. If you pull it to one side, you can probably get a visual there of it's just sitting too much. And it's mainly at the waist, but then it's at the bust as well. So rather than getting into finicky fine-tuning just yet, I think my next step is to make a smaller size. As it happens, after preliminary feedback from a few people, Lina decided to make some tweaks to the pattern at this point. So, while waiting for version 2 of the pattern, I whipped up a quick petticoat to coordinate with my Polonaise dress. Just a basic one, not following Lina's pattern. For petticoats, I normally just gather 2 rectangles of fabric into waistbands and sew them together at the sides, with small variations in terms of ties, hem depths, etc. I'm a big fan of petticoats. They are so easy to mix and match and so size adjustable as you tie the back and the front on separately. Welcome to Toile 2. It's been a few days since I last recorded because after we gave our feedback on the first mock-up, Lina decided to make some alterations to the pattern. My first toile and this are not a complete comparison between the two designs, as I also went down a size, which I am pleased with because I am very pleased with how these are looking. Version 2 of the pattern changed slightly. The waist was a little higher, the neckline was a little lower, the angle on the sleeve is a bit different, and also there is now additional boning in the front panel. And I also note that this time I haven't folded back the seam allowance at the neckline or around the armhole. I have folded up the waist, so the waist is sitting at the waistline. I am very happy with how this is looking, and I think we only need to make a few very minor tweaks and then ready to move on to the real thing. So first thing, you can probably tell that my stays are creeping out slightly above this. So I need to raise that neckline again. I think my plan is for now to ignore that the seam allowance is meant to be cut away and to cut away what I want to go and just cut that out of the pattern so that the pattern is the shape I want it to be and that there won't be any seam allowance at neckline or around the arm. My stays pretty much come just to that edge of the seam allowance and that this side has heaps under it. So I might end up with straps that are slightly wider than what the pattern dictates, coming fully out this side, and then probably trimming down to the intended seam allowance on that side. To deal with this gaping, I might just pull the sleeve in a little bit more on the inner side than out. We can see that the seam at the side is angled, not completely vertical, but leaning back. So the way I want to fix that is by taking a wedge out of the side back piece of probably 1 centimetre at the bottom, tapering up to nothing at the top. So I want to redo these side seams to get that seam to be vertical, because I also note at the bottom, at the very front, we are overlapping a little bit, unlike at the bust where it's just sitting very nicely abutting there. Adjustments made. So I've just inserted a little scrap to bring that up, and I think that's fine, that sort of amount, just to cover the stays there, and just provide that little bit more coverage of the bosom. And the big change in terms of fit on these is the side seam, which I'm now happy is sitting vertical enough, and at the very front we're parallel, we're laced so that we're just abutting but not overlapping. So yeah, very nearly there. So next, look at this strap and how much I want to get off. So I know I want to pull it in a little bit more. How much do I want to cut off? I've sketched on very messily that most of it I want to fold under the seam allowance so that it gets to the as original intended seam allowance point, including underneath. But at that just under there, I don't want it to come quite so far forward. So that's at the point where I don't want it to go. Just along there, I'd rather keep essentially as much of it as I've got. So let's take it off again, which is a bit of a pain, but that is the joy of fitting. And see if we can fine-tune the strap placement and the strap width. And with that last little adjustment and cutting down the seam allowance, I'm calling this fitted. You can see that adjusting that strap length and angle has smoothed this section out, and I'm happy with how the outside of the strap is sitting. I made the waist adjustments by taking the wedge out of the side back piece on both sides, but apart from that I didn't adjust this side at all. So you've got an idea of the unadjusted side and the adjusted side. So with that, I think I'll go and update the pattern. So here are my adjusted patterns. I didn't do anything to the back, save note that I won't be cutting away the seam allowance around the neckline. The side back, I have added in that wedge, and I've extended that side seam allowance to being 2.5 centimetres. The front is where the bulk of my changes happened. Bringing down the strap length and angling it slightly. Increasing just a smidgen under the arm, but still planning to take away the seam allowance there. Noting the 2.5 centimetre seam allowance there that I've added in. And I've just raised the neckline to the centre front slightly. There we are ready to make the real bodice. I cut the strength layer of my bodice pieces out of an offcut of small herringbone coutil. giving myself a little extra space at the centre front for folding back the bone casings. And I snipped notches at the registration marks. I laid out the skirt pattern pieces and cut out my size. I laid out my main fabric and tore off panels for the skirt pieces. It's hard to show in the footage, but I fiddled around and decided where I wanted my centre front to fall in the pattern of the print, and cut 3 centimetres over from that to account for the seam allowance. I then found the corresponding vector on the other side and cut the centre front of the other piece. Having pressed back the seam allowance on each piece at the centre front, I was reasonably happy with the alignment. I trimmed the top edges to match. From there, I trimmed everything to size. If I was just making it myself, I'd probably include more fullness in the skirt rather than cutting it away, or maybe pattern match the side seams. But when testing the pattern, I wanted to follow the pattern. I then repeated the process for the back skirt pieces, aiming to match the centre back seam. So, to help me lay out my pattern pieces, in addition to having the actual pattern, I've photocopied and then cut out the negative image. I haven't cut out the seam allowance, so I've cut it at the seam lines, although noting that we'll then be binding here and here. So yeah, that's my idea. I've transferred over the grain line, and essentially, if we're looking at the pattern, we can see there's groups of 3 flowers. So 3, 3, 3, 3. And my plan is to put those 3 flowers in the bodice. I marked where the corners of the pattern should be. To mark that corner. Then I laid on the actual pattern and cut the piece out. And there we are. That's my piece. I think that looks really pretty. I repeated the process for the second front piece. For the back pieces, I laid out the back skirt piece, then used my template to locate my bodice piece. I made markings on the corners, then used the pattern piece to cut it out. Okay, it's my first back piece. The second back piece was cut out similarly. Okay, and now onto the side back pieces. I'm so close. These are the last pieces to cut out. I mean, there's still bias binding and things, but this is the last of the pattern matching cutting, which is exciting. So I've got another strip, which was a skirt offcut, which is great. And I have put my outline over my actual back piece. And I've just been playing around with the placement of my side back piece. The nature of the curved seams, they can't be matched exactly all the way along. And I've decided to take the more art than science approach to this one. I'm focusing on the notch upwards. So from here upwards on this, and we can see that we're just on that final stamen on the notch. So here we can be on that final stamen, and then following around we've got that leaf with that leaf and the last little bit of that flower with that flower. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm not so stressed. I think I'm slightly off grain line, but I'm okay with it. And I'm just going to weight it down a little bit and make my markings. And there is my first side back piece, ready to join on there. Once the second back side was done, all my pieces were cut out. It was then time to assemble the bodice back. I pinned the back to the side back seam just around the notch. I stitched from the notch down to the waist, then went back to the notch and stitched from the notch up to the top. Then I repeated the process on the other side. I notched the seam allowance and pressed the seams open. Then I joined the centre back seam. And once that central seam is clipped and pressed, here we have the inside. And then that is the right side of the lining fabric, so that's what will be visible on the inside of the bodice. Next, I'll repeat the process with the fashion fabric, the outer layer, just taking those curves slightly more slowly as I'm attempting to pattern match. We'll see. I started with a long basting stitch, then checked my pattern matching. Then I dialed the stitch length down to 2 mm to lock it in. I did the same on the other side, then clipped and pressed the seams. The centre back was where I was particularly keen to pattern match. It did take a couple of attempts, but once done, I was very happy. It was then time to join the two layers together along the waist. I pressed the seam open, then closed, and lined up the seams, pinning to hold in place along the seams and the edges. I top stitched along the waist, then along the centre back, securing the seam allowances. Then the side back seam allowances, and I basted the layers together along the edges. Finally, I added the bone channels that fit just behind the side seam and the bone channels down the centre back. So here is the completed back of the bodice. And so we've got the bone channels in now, and I'm so happy with that pattern matching. Look at this. Whee! And time for the front of the bodice. Now, because I've added an extra 3 centimeters to the center front, I've just marked a line at the 3 centimeter point, and that's where I'm going to abut the fashion layer. Now, with right sides together and with the edge lined up on that line there, I've also marked on the sewing lines for at the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. We are ready to sew down the center front and along the waist. Here we are. I've sewn down the center front and along the waist, and I've clipped and notched the waist. So I'm ready to fold this and press it so it's right sides out. I trimmed the corner quite significantly and pressed right sides out. So here are the 2 front pieces with these front corners now nice and neat. Next, I top stitched all around the outside edge. I stitched the bone channels at the center front off camera, and I decided to thread mark where I wanted the diagonal bone channels to go, which I then stitched, keeping the foot to either side of the thread. Okay, so here we have the 2 front bodice pieces ready to go, ready to be boned. We can see, well, I'm not sure how much you can see or not. I can see the boning channels there. Can you? So there's the front 2 there. There's the one I've put there and the one from the original version of the pattern there. I'm happy with that. I don't think I'd want one going all the way up into the strap, and I know you can end them anywhere you want, but I think it makes sense to me to end at the neckline. So there we are. So far so good. So the bones are all synthetic whalebone. Let's put them in, and at the front I'm going in between the 2 layers of couture. Which was my little variation. I wiggled the bones into the channels and did the same on the back pieces. And then I put the eyelets in. Quick try on, and I don't think we're quite right. So I managed to sort of pull it together at the waist, but that makes it very tight, tighter than I think I want from this garment, because this is not my stays, this is a bodice. So, and we can't get it done at the top, which in and itself I don't mind, but I've patterned it to be flat at the top, and with this angle change, it's then slightly gapey. So I think I want to let it out 1/2 centimetre on each seam. And I think the time has come to trim down the arm sides. So that's next, and then I'll come back. But I'll just get a little shot of where I am here. So here we are. I've let out each side seam by 0.5 centimetres, so adding a total of 2 centimetres to the circumference of this bodice. I am noticing, and it's just my body shape, and perhaps the way it does up, it gapes a little bit at the waist and a little bit at the top, because I have less space. I'm just not perfectly conical. Even with stays on, I'm not perfectly conical. That's not what my body does. Not what I want. Yeah, like you can sort of see it of an angle. I'm not flat. I have shape. And I'm okay with that. I like my shape. So I am happy with this. I will go ahead and do the binding. Yeah, we're all good. I unpicked the side seams and stitched the strap securely. Then I pressed the seam open, trimmed down the coutil, and folded under the raw edge. I top stitched each side of the seam and arrived at a neatly bound strap seam. I cut strips of bias to use as binding and stitched one along the neckline in my usual fashion. I pressed the bias, folded it under and pinned it in place. Then I stitched in the ditch. A final press and the neckline was complete. I repeated the binding process on the other edges. I overlocked the 4 side seam edges and stitched the side seams. So I thought I'd just quickly record a little view of the bodice that is completed. I'm really happy with it. I think it's going to work really well in my Hobbit wardrobe. That's the side. The back is lovely and smooth, and I'm very happy with my pattern matching. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to getting the skirt on. I do note that I probably could go longer at the sides if I was to make this again, or particularly if I was to make a bodice that I wasn't going to add a skirt onto. I'd probably want to add sides. I reserve my judgment for what it looks like with the skirt. I think this is a good placement for with the skirt. I think that will go well. I basted the centre back seam of the skirts, then checked I was happy with the pattern matching, before then stitching the seam. I also attached the front skirt panels so the skirt was all one large piece, and I overlocked the seams. I had a long facing fabric piece with a neat selvage edge, which I had purposely put aside when making my coordinating petticoat. I stitched this to the bottom of the skirt. I pressed the seam towards the facing, then folded the facing up and pressed it. I did a line of top stitching along the hem to hold all the layers in place. With the hem and facing sitting smoothly, I fold the skirt to be 1 centimetre back from the facing edge. Measuring and then pinning in place. So I switched to my Janome DM720 and put on the blind hem foot. I stitched the blind hem, which mainly sews along the facing and just puts the occasional stitch through the outer layer. And just before I unfold it all, so this is what it looks like from this side, where we've just taken little nips in to the fashion layer, and on the inside it looks like that on the hem side. So let's unfold it and give it a good press. And just as a view, once it's all opened out, so this is my bottom hem and this is the blind hem holding the top of the facing to the outside. And then from this side I am very pleased. So that's the top stitching down there, and when we go in close you can probably see the little stitches of the blind hem, but once we come out I don't think that's particularly noticeable at all. I'm very happy with that. Lovely. Next I pressed under the side edges of the skirt and top stitched to secure. I laid out my skirt and marked where the buttons needed to go. Back to this machine, and this time it's the buttonhole foot. And I have marked where I previously marked with the pins where I want these buttonholes to go. I always find it satisfying to see the buttonholes come into existence. Right, here we are, buttonholes are on. And I'm ready to pleat. And so I will be pleating down, I'll start with pleating down the two back pieces to get them into the backs, so including back and side back, but to get that into there. That's my plan. And while pleating is not my favourite activity, I followed the template and did get it done. Then I basted down the pleats to hold them in place. I laid the skirt along the bodice and pinned each pleat in place. The final prep step was to pin on the bustle ties. Then I top stitched the skirt to the bodice. Okay, it's officially attached and all in one piece. And I've removed the basting and pressed this down. So now we just have all the finishing to do. So there's the buttons to sew on and the little patches and loops to do for the bustle. I attached the buttons to the centre front of the skirt. I identified where the bustle loops needed to go and found scraps of fabric of the same part of the pattern. I fused rectangles of bondaweb to my scraps, cut out little pieces with pinking shears, placed over the desired location, then fused to the main part of the skirt. Then I made a thread loop of each bustle point. With that, the Polonaise dress was complete, and I could thread the ties through the loops to bustle it up. I was also a pattern tester for the Georgian Petticoat Skirt, and that was a very simple, smooth process. It really was just making the garment, following along, and then providing any feedback on if we thought either the instructions or the pattern needed to be made clearer or tweaked in any way. I chose a rayon print for my petticoat skirt. Similarly to my normal petticoat, there are rectangles for the front and back and waist ties. A big difference is the built-in pockets, which get attached to the side back near the side. A pocket slit is cut, then the slit is folded out and stitched around to secure that raw edge. The back of the pocket was attached, and the edges were bound with a strip of bias. The rest of the assembly was fairly straightforward. Overall, I'm not particularly a fan of pleating. I find the process annoying, and on my body I generally prefer a gathered skirt to add some volume rather than a pleated one. So, conversely, I'm very grateful to Lina that I now have pleated skirts on this petticoat and on the Polonaise dress, as it adds variance and interest to my hobbit wardrobe. And I do really like the garments that I have made. When going full hobbit, I do tend to use my regular tie-on pockets, but I've also gotten a lot of use from the petticoat skirt in my day-to-day life. So that was the process of getting to be a pattern tester for two of Lina's beautiful creations. It was a really wonderful experience. Apart from being a pattern tester, Lina, I think, is in strong contender for most constant and detailed Kickstarter updates ever. Seeing all of the steps behind the scene was absolutely really insightful and jaw-dropping at the attention to detail required. And then to be part of the pattern testing group was another level of community that was just really lovely to be a part of. I have already gotten lots of use out of my Polonaise dress and my petticoat skirt. And I thought I'd just take a couple of seconds at the end here to show you this beautiful, beautiful book. There are 3 patterns inspired by the Georgian era, 2 from the Romantic era, and 2 inspired by the Edwardian era. The Georgian is probably the closest to my hobbity heart, but I am excited to make certainly things from the Romantic one as well. And we'll see about Edwardian, maybe down the track. And the instructions in the book are just gorgeous, both within all the patterns and the technique section at the start. They're very clearly written, as well as being illustrated and with lots and lots of photographs. In the book itself, there are 3 sizes of gridded patterns, and then there is a wide range of sizes available in the PDF and paper patterns. If you're interested in getting a copy for yourself, I'll be sure to leave all the details below. And please do let me know what you make and how you find it. I'm so excited to see all the beautiful garments that I'm sure are going to come from this wonderful, wonderful book. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you can join me again next time. Goodbye.